over multiple lists.
Oh, really?
I think it's crazy powerful.
Cool.
Stole it from Matt.
All right, so I'm Ryan. I also work at Freely. And
Today, I mean, that's like a winner race sport. So.
tomorrow it's up in the air. I'm going to feel it out, and then we'll see what's going on. So that was really cool. Seeing how David was solving some problems. So I wanted to also kind of show you a little app that I've been working on the side for like an hour or two, and that's really all the time I put into it. But so recently, Slack came out with their platform. So they've had kind of like webhooks, and I think they even had kind of an API before, but they packaged it up into more of a platform where you can kind of create your own Slack app, and it can respond, it can serve as a Slackbot, like a chatbot. It can also handle / commands, which in Slack you do like / and special command and passive arguments, and it can act based on that. And so I wanted to explore that a little bit, and messaging, real-time messaging, Elixir makes a lot of sense. So I wanted to, I'll just go ahead and show you the functionality. If you look, my first test was like, okay, what could I make a useful Slack / command for? And I thought, okay, well, we have at Freely, we have our docs, it's docs.freely.com, our technical documentation, and actually we refer to them internally a lot too, because they're pretty decent. So our customers refer to it, but we also refer to it internally a lot too. And I thought, okay, well, it would be cool if I could search the Spreedly docs from within Slack. If I'm having a conversation with support or one of my coworkers, and we have a question, I can just pull it up right here. So I want to be able to do /docs and then some search term and get some results back. So that's what it looks like. All it does is just give you 3 of the most recent relevant results with the links, the description, everything like that. Dumps it right in there for you. So that's what it does. And nobody uses it, so it was a terrible idea, but it was a lot of fun. So I'm going to show you.
I didn't know it existed.
I announced it in Slack.
I've used it.
You didn't tell me about it.
Nobody in the last 2 days has used it, and that's as far back as my analytics go. So I'll walk through a couple interesting things about the application. First, if you just go back, let's look at how the message gets from Slack to the Slackbot. It's actually quite simple. If you go over to the side here, /commands, their docs are pretty decent. They kind of walk you through the concepts behind it, but this is where the money is right here. This is the body of the request that Slack sends to your bot. And it's just a simple key value pair, simple form encoded body, and it in your Phoenix controller gets mapped to the params, right, which are passed in with every action. So here's the controller in Phoenix that handles the request from Slack. And because I know that all I care about is the /docs command, and all I care about is the arguments to that command, which comes across as in the text field, I just pattern match on any request that comes in with those 2 params. And the logic of the search happens here in the search method, and I'll talk about that later. But if it's a request I know I care about, I'll pass it off to search. And if it's anything else, I just return a text that says, can't do anything with that. I think I can actually invoke that use case if I send it nothing. Yeah, never mind. I sent back a internal server error, and I don't know if I think it might be expecting JSON or something there. But the interesting part about this, so we've got that very clean controller action based on the request parameters. It's very easy to see when the logic kicks in. And the search happens down here by calling this search API thing, which is an object that has a search method. So as I was developing this, a lot of times when you're developing against a remote service, you always come to that point where you're like, okay, now I have to test the actual interaction with the actual remote service. So there's different ways different strategies for doing this. There's mocks and other things you can do. But I remember that Josè Valim, the Elixir guy, had recently written a blog post about kind of his thoughts around mocking, mocks, that whole concept of using mocks in tests. So I read the article. His premise basically, what he didn't like, what he was saying was when people would mock like a method deep in the implementation during their tests. So the example he gives in his article is if you're building an integration with Twitter, and in your tests, when you are testing the Twitter integration, you mock the HTTP client that Twitter library is using. His point is you are now binding your tests to that specific implementation, whatever Twitter uses. So if you change out your Twitter, or the Twitter implementation itself uses a different HTTP library, now you've got problems, your test will break. So his point was that mocks should be thought of as nouns. They're things you use, they're objects themselves, they're not something you do to existing objects. And he runs through this example. Definitely recommend going and reading this. It's on the Plataforma Tech blog. It's called Mocks and Explicit Contracts. So I read this, I was like, okay, that sounds like a good idea, but I want to see how it works in practice. So I used this strategy in this Slackbot. So how did it manifest? Well, the first thing he says is you want to isolate where that remote behavior interacts with the remote service into as small of a thing as possible. So I have this search concept, like it's a search component. I have one that actually hits Google, the thing that holds our docs index, and I have a mock search object, okay? And they both have a single method called search that takes a query and it returns an array of results. It's this struct I've defined called search result, and that's kind of the contract. So in my tests, if we look at, so I can actually, so in my controller test, I've set my test environment to use a mock version of my search component. But in production and development, I actually use the Google version of my search component. And the way I switch those in and out is in my config settings. There we go. I have a config. This is my development config setting. I say the search API configuration setting, set it to the actual Google search component. And if you look in my test environment config, I say set it to the mock version. Okay? So based on environment, I'm giving my app the component I want it to use. The app itself doesn't need to concern itself with anything else. And the testing remains true to it. So when you have these two components that your application is treating as adhering to the same interface, you want a way to be explicit about what that interface is, right? Because your remote component, might, during the implementation, start adding a few things here or there, and your implementations will diverge a little bit. So you want to be really explicit and define a contract for your components. And the way to do that is within Elixir what's called a behavior. It's basically like an interface in the Java world. It defines the methods that are available, or that should be present. So let's look at my search behavior. It's just a module. This is a normal module, but you just say use behavior, and you define the callbacks, basically define the methods that should be present in every object that says that it uses my search behavior. Okay, so I'm saying everything that calls itself a search component should define the search method that takes a single argument of type string, and it returns an array of this data structure, which is my own struct called search result. Okay? So now if we look at our implementation of the Google search, so here's my Google search, and here line 3 is where I'm saying I declare that I adhere to this behavior, this search behavior, and the compiler will then enforce that it has the right functions defined. You see here, it's just a method search, takes a query, the internal implementation doesn't matter. That's the public interface that's been defined. So that's my Google version, and then if you look at my mock version, so in the Google version, you see it actually makes an actual HTTP request out using this library. It's obviously the live version. The mock version, I just return a static list there. You can imagine there might be other types of mock search components that I wanted to use, but it's just the basic one. It works great. So that is how that problem is solved. So just because we have this slightly more structured way of doing things doesn't mean that we still don't have to test the actual remote interface, right? The actual call to the Google API. We still want tests that do live calls out to the remote API. But we don't want those to run all the time, because those are the expensive tests, right? And there may be rate limits and other things we want to be cognizant of. So what we do is in our tests, where I'm actually testing, so here's my model test, where I'm testing the actual Google search component itself. What I do is I give the module a tag called remote, and then when I run my tests, by default, obviously everybody can read that, if I do mixed test, is that a dog?
There's a dog here.
It's like in my zone. You see, by default, it does not run.
I saw that.
You
Like
saw that?
Matrix.
It says excluding tags remote. So by default, it will not run tag tests. If you want to run the tag tests, ignore the Heroku local run stuff. You can just say include in whatever tag that you want to include. And you see it pauses because it was hitting Google directly, and now it's run 3 tests instead of 2, that one is remote. If you were just testing your remote interface, you can do only.
I'm having a hard time ignoring the Heroku local run.
Sorry. I called attention to it. So, again, you haven't, there's no silver bullet when you're testing remote services. At some point, you need to make those calls and test that whatever component is interacting with that service works. But the point is to isolate that to a very well-defined component, and that is your mock. That's a thing that your application can use and can be interchanged with. Mocking, I didn't reach in to the Google library and mock out my HTTP library to run these tests. Okay? So that was kind of the whole thing there. Okay, I think this is it. Yes. So, any questions on that?
So were you happy with the approach? Did you, after implementing it the way that Josè mentioned, do you think the results were good?
Yes, they were good. It felt very clean. One of the criticisms you see a lot of times when you are doing something a little different in the name of testing is that you shouldn't be changing your implementation to make it more testable. And the argument here, and I think it's a valid one, is that your app is more testable, but it's because it's architected better. Right? It has better, well-defined components, and that's what makes it more testable. So you're not doing something just in the name of testing. It's a side effect of a general improvement that you've made. And I definitely feel like that is the case.